I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar series of the Cybersecurity and Information Systems Information Analysis Center, CSIAC. Today's presentation is entitled Threat Intelligence Program. My name is Steve Warzala, and I'm the CSIAC Outreach Manager. A few administrative notes before we begin. First, all phones have been muted except for the presenters. Questions may be asked at any time during the presentation by utilizing the chat function. In time permitting, your questions will be answered at the end of the session. Today's briefing slides will be posted on our website within a couple of days. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC. The funding that DTIC provides enables CSIAC to conduct these webinars. My pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Mr. TJ Minichiello. TJ currently serves as a Vice President of Cyber Threat and Intelligence with Kiavi Data. He is a cybersecurity and intelligence professional with over 25 years of leadership and management experience, helping to detect and thwart many of the world's significant cyber threats. Mr. Minichiello has held strategic intelligence roles in financial services, military, and energy, including Global Head of Threat Intelligence at both National Grid and Morgan Stanley, Deputy Director at Citigroup's Cyber Intelligence Center, Chief Cyber Intelligence Officer at Merrill Lynch, and Senior Intelligence Special Agent at the Department of Defense. As a cybersecurity consultant, TJ has directed information security best practices at several cybersecurity startups, as well as companies like Unisys and Booz Allen and Hamilton. I will now turn the presentation over to Mr. Minichiello. Good afternoon, TJ. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. So good morning, afternoon all. I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about threat intel. So in general, throughout my career, for the better part of my career, so I've basically built, managed threat intelligence teams. A lot of in most cases, these teams were part of a security operation. I built and managed fusion centers, vulnerability management, incident response functions. So as you're probably aware, I've done this for very large companies, but I've also done it for very small companies. So the reason I point that out is that in general, the core competencies or these building blocks that we're going to talk about today, most times I've used all of these building blocks in the small, medium, and large companies that I've built these programs with, but they all look a little bit different. So today we'll talk about the building blocks that you'll need to build this kind of function. So in general, the reason that they're all different is the sole missions of the teams that I've built is really to better understand the motives, the capabilities, and the intent of the bad guy or the adversary. We want to try to understand their most recent tactics. We want to understand how they're compromised security controls. And then we want to determine, based on the tactics that they're using, if the security controls that are designed to protect the network systems, our applications, and data from the threats, they're basically, they can in fact detect and protect against the bad guys. So when they get in, because as you've probably heard in the media or others, they always find a way in. We want to be able to assess how bad the damage is. We want to contain that exposure, and then we want to basically get back to normal business operations. So this is typical day, typical life of a threat intelligence team that typically supports a security operations. We're constantly trying to assess, we're trying to determine, we're trying to understand, if the company's crown jewels are safe. The reason that most threat intelligence teams or professionals do this, it's not only for job security. It's because we fundamentally want to build security into our business operation. So we want to securely enable business to perform some of the core functions to be successful. We want to win the battle against the bad guy in general. We want to try and enable that. So the question I've always asked, or I ask a lot to myself and anything is, are our crown jewels protected? Is our data protected? So in my opinion, the short answer to that is that we as a security community, we're definitely trying very hard to protect, the network, our systems, the applications. This. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm seeing
Yep. No, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay, sorry about that. So basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to stay ahead of the next threat. So I always ask myself, how, can threat intelligence help? Where do we interface? What does the team look like? What tools do we need? And basically, how do we measure value to the business? That's been what I typically call return on intel investment. So that's a typical life of a threat intelligence program. So this is just my perspective on things. So I wrote this, I was working for a research firm a few years back, and I wrote this perspective on what I think intelligence can do. So I really believe that threat intel, it can help an organization. It's not only just protect its technology infrastructure, but it also can help protect the company's brand and reputation. And it also can help protect the data or the crown jewels that most businesses rely on, to either make a decision or be competitive in the market or deliver a service. I really feel that threat intelligence, if implemented correctly, could do all those things. So many of you guys are probably very familiar with defense in depth. So our entire defense in depth strategy today, I feel like it's built around protecting data that's within our infrastructure, processed by our systems and used in our applications. So the next evolution of threat intel, as I see it, is intelligent and self-aware data. So that's designed to reduce your attack surface, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it can also enrich your threat model when your data or organizational data travels outside your typical protective infrastructure. So I think the next evolution is to enroll as an enrichment source intelligent and self-aware data. So in general, most organizations, they have a really good handle on locking down their company infrastructure or classic data center. But in many cases, the data that's critical to our company, these crown jewels, that has to flow in and out of our infrastructure. And in many instances, once it travels outside the company infrastructure, you typically lose control over it. So what threat intelligence, the next era of this threat intelligence would be able to report back is, where is that data located? Who's accessing it? What device it's on? Are they authorized to access that? So this next evolution of threat intel to support other security folks that are trying to protect data, this next evolution is this ingestion of where data is when it's outside of your typical infrastructure, who's accessing it, and is it during the correct time frame. And then once you take that intel in as a feed, you can start to make decisions. So if you find that your data is sitting on a device that's in an unauthorized geography outside of your infrastructure, you could take action against it. The incident responder can use that intelligence and make a decision on, do we need to recall it or disable it. So So sometimes our data, as mentioned, it basically travels outside of our infrastructure. We've certainly seen this in the increase in remote working during COVID. Also, sometimes it travels outside because it's stolen or accidentally sent. And we see this in data loss incidents. So our new challenge is, how do we protect data everywhere so we can enable business? And when it travels, how can threat intelligence help better protect our crown jewels? So that's kind of the perspective that I'm trying to talk about here. Threat intelligence in general, it's really designed to fill critical intel gaps. And I'll talk about this in a little bit. I'll give you a few examples about, and the intel gaps that it can fill is, where is your data located when it travels outside? Should it be there? And who's authorized to access it? So those are some answers to intel gaps that you may have about your data. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. All right. So what's the current situation? I like to kind of frame, what the current situation is. So as I mentioned before, I built, managed threat intel programs for a variety of different companies and organizations. So when I was building and managing the cyber intelligence center at Citigroup, I participated in an OD&I funded study that was facilitated through Carnegie Mellon University. I'll talk a little bit about this later because I think it's something important for you guys to know. The research report is freely available, and it's a good resource for you. But in general, the project that I participated back in 2013 was called the Cyber Intelligence Tradecraft Project. It was basically a 6-month effort. It was designed to baseline the status of threat intel programs across 6 government agencies and 20 organizations, and they range within our critical infrastructure. So through industry and academia, it was just a good representation of our critical infrastructure. I'll talk a little bit more about this study and how you can use the research after today's presentation. So what's the current situation? So over the years, I basically have found that a lot of organizations are either very mature, this is companies these are organizations like the government, law enforcement, or financial services, and some are less mature in other sectors related to their threat intelligence program. That was specifically found not only in my experience, but through this research that was conducted that I just mentioned. But what I consistently found is that all organizations were doing some sort of threat intel function. And I also found that companies that were performing threat intel functions may not have called it threat intel. So you may be doing threat intelligence functions in the organization and not labeling it as that. So I'll talk a lot about, what these building blocks are and what functions are typically within a threat intelligence team. But this could be, you participated in an ISAC or information sharing. This could be conducting threat hunting, enriched with external threat actor indicators that you collect through various sources. This could be publishing a threat landscape report. This could also be trying to informally fill intel gaps about the threat actor, typically their motives, capabilities, or intent of the latest cyber attack that you're witnessing. So in many of the organizations I work with, a lot of them were performing threat intel functions as another duty is assigned, or some of them are doing it out of career interest because it's newer and that sort of thing. But in general, what I did find, because I also used to consult to many industries around building threat intel programs, is that one of the things that they're dealing with inside the company, if it's not a mature threat intel program, or sometimes it could be a mature intel program, what they're dealing with is the organization not understanding what the program is, and more importantly, what is their role to interact with it. So I found that that was very common in the programs that I've kind of helped build. So I'll give you an example. So when I was at my first threat intel job, it was back in 2003, 2004 timeframe, was at Merrill Lynch. So I needed to figure out what threat intelligence not only meant for Merrill Lynch, but back then we were trying to figure out what threat intelligence meant for a financial service company. So I had a few peers that I worked with at other financials, and we were all trying to figure out, what is this? What does a threat intelligence program mean for a large multinational financial services company? So one of the ways that I try to communicate that is that I developed an analogy on intel gaps. And that analogy was between a threat intel function, an incident response or forensics team, and then a data loss prevention team. So I established this analogy that we all need to help each other fill intel gaps about a data breach. So the way that I communicated it, and I really wanted to communicate the value that I, as the threat intelligence team, could provide them because it was relatively new. I basically took it, I explained it as, from a data loss prevention perspective, that team, they could typically tell the business if data had traveled outside the company to a personal Gmail account or other ways. But as soon as the data left the company infrastructure, they had an intelligence gap. Where did the data travel next? Where is it today? And who's trying to access it since it left? They couldn't tell the business if the data was compromised, lost, or stolen. They assumed it when they lost control over it. So that from a data loss prevention side, I said that is what your role is in the organization. From an incident response and forensics perspective, the way I described it is I said that you guys could talk to the business about is malware was the malware that was installed on an endpoint, did it have a key logging function that captured data? They could assume that the data collected was exfiltrated and lost. Because of the type of malware was used, they could look at network logs and such, and they could say, okay, yes, it was infected with this piece of malware and data had left. But again, as soon as the data was exfiltrated outside of the organization, they basically still couldn't tell that the data traveled outside the infrastructure, where it is today, or did anyone try to access it once it left? So the only way these teams know today is when a public disclosure of data is posted online. Typically, ransomware operators will do that now if you don't pay a ransom. But in general, they won't really know the extent of the exfiltration until it's publicly known. So that's kind of how I framed it for forensics. So then I had to frame it for threat intel, and I had to say that, okay, so I can tell both data loss prevention and forensics teams, incident response teams, where the data is being sold in the dark web marketplace, what specific cyber criminal or potential nation state affiliation was selling it, and potentially the online aliases that's considering purchasing the company data. If I had access to those criminal forms, I could report that, okay? What threat intel couldn't tell them is how it was compromised unless they had like a threat hunt function that was separate from the incident response and forensics function. If they had that, they could tell them other things. But in general, they could only tell them what they knew based on the access they had inside the deep web forum. What we couldn't tell them is, how many threat actors have access or possession of this data, where it's being used and such. So in general, even threat intel, we could paint a part of the picture and contribute intel to those two teams so they could further enrich their incidents and investigations. So that's kind of a strategy that I use to kind of explain what a threat intel function. Typically, the way that we connected these dots, and it's still present today, is basically through information sharing between these teams. This is still pretty much used today. So one of the exciting aspects of self-protecting intelligence data is that our data now can fill these intel gaps. Our data itself can be this glue, if you will, between these functions and can fill these intel gaps very quickly. So instead of having to speculate where your data has traveled, who accessed it, and on what devices have been stored. So now our data can provide this critical threat intel in near real time wherever it travels. So that's the tie-in to self-protecting data. It can now be a threat intel feed, if you will. All right, so let's move on. So talk a little bit more about threat intel program. So a core function of any threat intel team is basically to determine and focus on the threat actor group behind the cyber attack. It could be a cyber attack, it could be a breach, it could be a compromise. So some companies, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, but some companies want to specifically know the affiliation. They're interested in understanding that. But others, depending on your organization, you may find that they don't care about the affiliation. All they really want to do is act on the actionable indicators so they can evaluate the controls they have in place and they can protect the organization from the threat. So depending on your company, make sure you're reporting the correct threat intel to the right groups, because if you don't, your program won't be successful. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about collection planning and how you can do this. But one of the reasons that you need to know the affiliation, I'll use two different botnets. One is called Brobot, which was an Iranian botnet used years ago, and another is a fraud-based botnet called Dirt Jumper. So knowing what was attacking us and who was behind that, what I could do as a threat intel perspective is that if I saw an attack coming from a known Iranian group that's using Brobot, and I know that all they're really interested in is availability, so they want to bring down a site, and I know that if they're using credential reuse or they're trying to brute force into a web service, but I know that they're not doing it for fraud, I need to mobilize a certain group in an organization around availability. But if you're dealing with a fraud-based cyber attack, you need to mobilize different people inside the organization. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to understand who is attacking you, because you're trying to understand the motive intent of the compromise, so you can enable the right resources internally to defend against it. Anyway, either way, if your stakeholder community doesn't care who's behind the threat, you should still collect on it, but don't let that consume the conversation when you're talking to them about threat intel. So it basically goes without saying that there are various threat actors that specifically steal, hold hostage, misuse our data, and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to go deep into the specific, events that we have happened, but in general, between Russia and China, they typically focus on certain things. So China-based threat actors, they have historically, they've been known to target intellectual property, trade secrets, military information, sensitive data that they can use in some instances for Chinese companies to benefit or gain a competitive advantage. The most recent supplier that gained a lot of attention, I'm sure many of you are aware, is the telecom manufacturer Huawei. The underlying decision of Huawei has been, should companies conduct business with them or other foreign manufacturers as part of an integrated supply chain? So the way threat intelligence could help inform that decision is to collect and report the threat intelligence related to Huawei and how that company could have been used or can be used to advance government objectives. So you're influencing a business decision with threat intel by collecting and reporting intel about a specific threat. So that's another way that you influence. The other way that you could influence is through your supply chain. So many companies will want to know who's in their integrated supply chain. They may not want to share certain data with certain suppliers, or they might want to recall that data when the relationship with that contractor or subcontractor has ended. So the recent example that I talk about happened a couple months ago, maybe it happened this year. It was related to the Japanese defense ministry. So what they were doing is they were running a competitive bid to build a new warplane. And Mitsubishi, who was one of the contractors bidding on it, was compromised. And the threat stole sensitive data that was shared legitimately through the bidding process. So at the end of the day, Mitsubishi didn't win the award, but they still had sensitive data related to the bid process. What happened was a threat actor came in and stole that, and then potentially compromised the project where they were developing a weapon system. So anyway, the idea is threat intel could have helped if it could have been able to report where that data was being shared throughout the supply chain, and it could report back, if they were supposed to have access to it. So that's one of the ways that intelligence self-aware data can help provide threat intel into your integrated supply chain when you need to share data with these contractors in your supply chain. So, all right, so let's move on to the next one. Okay, so in general, how does threat intel support defense in depth? And what should you guys be doing now? So this slide typically represents a lot of the the tools that most security teams have at their disposal to protect data. So it's based on defensive depth. It includes physical security, policy and procedure, network-based controls like firewall, IDS, IPS, VPNs, data loss prevention, host-based security controls like AV, malware, email gateway controls, web proxy, all these different controls that we need in place to really protect the data. But in most of the sensitive investigations that I've been involved in, they either led or been part of, looking at the data itself and the compromise to it. So in general, the underlying question is not only, how far into the infrastructure a threat is embedded, but, once they're in, what data do they have access to? If any of the data was manipulated or stolen, this is when you find evidence of that, this is like the Houston, we have a problem scenario. And it leads to, the requirement to disclose that you've been compromised. So once you find evidence of that, it's a reportable, in many industries, it's a reportable event. So how could threat intelligence help manage through that? So one of the things that I've wanted to focus on is, helping security professionals be able to confidently report to the board, how do we know the company rules are secure wherever it travels? So the way that they do that now is they go through all of these defense in depth systems, they correlate things, they investigate things, they read logs, they try to find forensics evidence of things, and it takes a lot of time and effort. All of that needs to continue. All of it needs to continue. But with threat intel, how can we make that job easier? Is really the problem that I'm kind of focused on now. Is like how can threat intel better support defense in depth with the intel that they can report? Let's move on to let's get into some of the roadmap discussion now. Okay, so how do we get there? So these are 4 buckets, if you will, that I use to break down the building blocks to basically establish a threat intel program. It's basically 4 building blocks. So one is program planning, another is collection management, and I'll go through these. The third is an analytical framework, and the fourth is basically collaboration and feedback. So I'm gonna talk about these building blocks in the next slide, but I'm gonna talk about it in the context of how the Cyber Intelligence Tradecraft Project views them. The reason I want to do this is there's a 175-page public, and I have a link for the report. It's publicly available. It could be used to kind of reinforce some of these building blocks that I'm talking about. And so after today's webinar, you have more information that you can draw on to help you develop your program. So the only building block that I have a little bit different is program planning. So I typically use that, but it's not explicitly addressed as a module in the CMU research that I'll talk about in a minute. Collection management that I'll talk about, the CMU report will call that data gathering. Analytical framework, the CMU study will call threat and strategic analysis, I'll talk about. And then collaboration and feedback, they typically call reporting and feedback. All of these, if you're familiar with the intelligence lifecycle, all of these are a modification of an intelligence lifecycle that's been around for decades. A lot of companies will just reuse that. All right, so let me talk about the CMU study, and I'll kind of talk about it in the context of how I typically structure a threat intel program. So as I mentioned, I was part of this program back in 2013. I was at Citigroup, and I represented the financial sector. So the breakdown of the building blocks for the CMU study is environmental context, data gathering, threat analysis, strategic analysis, and then reporting and feedback. These are kind of mapped to some of the things that I've done in the past. But after reading the 2018 report, and I wasn't involved in the 2018 study. I was only involved in the 2013 study. But after reading the 2018 report, what I found is that the general feel is that threat intelligence programs have gotten stronger across the infrastructure in these different parts of the critical infrastructure, but in general, there's still needed still needed improvement. So to me, that really means that we're still seeing maturity in organizations developing or exploring to develop threat intel program throughout the critical infrastructure, but they're still not mature. And I definitely saw that as I moved from the financial sector. And then when I was working for a research company, I used to work with academia, I used to work with manufacturing, I used to work with higher ed, and some other industries. And then I've also worked with energy sector. As you know, I worked at National Grid before this. And I definitely have seen that there's a difference in a level of maturity with some of the building blocks with threat intel. So you may be in those sectors. You may work for an organizations that are in a sector where threat intel isn't as mature as other sectors. Where I've seen it most commonly unmature is in terms of information sharing. So in the financial sector, it was very common for our peers across the financial sector to share real-time threat intel with each other. Now there are tools and platforms that could do this automated in an automated fashion, but in terms of the information sharing, it was very mature. Whereas other sectors, it may not be as mature. A lot of that could be for legal or compliance reasons, but in general, the information sharing cross-sector in other industries may not be as mature. So what is environmental context? So basically, this is one of the building blocks in a threat intel program, and this is really all about establishing this deep understanding of your organizational attack surface, the specific threats that you're facing, the opportunities that exist that a threat actor could target your organization. So what this is really talking about is, look at your attack surface, look at the threats that you're facing, look at avenues that you that exist within your organization to figure out what type of threat intel program you need to support that. So you may need to partner with your penetration testing and vulnerability assessment team. Some threat intelligence programs will have red team under them. Some of them will have a threat hunt function under them. But in any event, to be able to get true environmental context, you're going to need to partner with internal teams to understand that. Once you have that baseline, then you can provide threat intel that will enrich and provide specific threats to that environment. So that's kind of what they talk about in terms of environmental context. Data gathering is another building block in a threat intel program. It's specifically tied to the inventory and use of tooling, basically at your disposal to be able to tie your security tools, the tool investment, if you will, to intel gaps that you're trying to fill. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But in general, it's really, you need to inventory the tools that you have at your disposal. You need to identify gaps in tools that are not in place to help you detect some of the attacks against your attack surface or threats that you're facing. So data gathering is really about inventorying tools and putting in place the tooling that you have to manage threats to your organization. So threat analysis as opposed to strategic analysis. So threat analysis is really all about the intel team, the analysis that the intel team has done, both technical analysis and non-technical analysis specific to your organization. So it's really that analysis of the threat that they can use to inform tactical, operational, or strategic stakeholders within your organization so they can inform decision-making. So threat analysis is really around building this capability so you can inform stakeholders to make decisions. And those decisions, I mentioned one earlier, as do we do business with this supplier? That could be a one. The other decision could be, do we need to enforce a company-wide security control because we're seeing threats coming in around a particular threat vector that we're not protected against? So threat analysis is really all about taking the technical and non-technical analysis around what your organization is seeing, and then sharing that with the proper stakeholders so they can make a decision. Strategic analysis is basically to help inform business decisions. So the most clear example I can use, as I mentioned before, is should we do business or should a company do business with a foreign supplier that has a history of using cyber espionage or other tactics against U.S. Companies and that sort of thing. So strategic analysis is really about stepping up, the analysis away from the tactical analysis and being able to present it to a board or a CEO or a leadership team so you can help them make an informed decision. Another, very common building block is reporting and feedback. I talk a lot about product portfolio. This is really the distribution portfolio that you're going to use to send intel to your stakeholder community. So this could be an alert, it could be a report, it could be a briefing, it could be a feed into the SIM, it could be a ton of different things. But basically what you need, one of the building blocks is you really need to develop this product portfolio and then have it consistently sent to your stakeholder community. The feedback loop, which is standard in a intelligence life cycle, as I mentioned, been around for a long time. Feedback is critical too, because if you're sending intel to a stakeholder group, you got to remember that they have a regular job too. So they don't want to be overloaded with threat intel that doesn't mean anything to them, or they can't use it, or they can't action it. So this happens at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. So you really need to implement either a formal or informal feedback loop to talk with the stakeholders that you're sharing intel with and ask for feedback. Is this useful? Are you using it? What changes do I need to make it more useful? And really getting that feedback. So the other thing that the CMU study talks about is human-machine teaming. I typically have called this a threat collaboration environment. This is really all about either automating or manually developing a workflow for the interaction of how you're going to produce intelligence in a timely and actionable way. So it's really all about getting intel into the team, getting it processed, getting it triaged, getting it analyzed, and then getting it out to the appropriate stakeholder communities. A long time ago, this was all a manual process. There's certain tools on the market now that will automate the orchestration of this. A lot of organizations are looking into that. They're automating threat intelligence into SIM. They're automating the correlation of threat intel with data that you would typically see in security tech. So a lot of this is automated. But in general, what Carnegie Mellon is talking about, human-machine teaming, is all about being able to streamline intel coming in and getting out to the right users for action. So I want to talk a little bit about program planning a bit, because this isn't really explicitly discussed or addressed in the CMU study. But basically, in the past, I've used Excel, I've used SharePoint to do what I'm about to talk about. So as a program planning activity, so you must define your organization's intel needs. A lot of the intel, if you have an intel background or law enforcement background, these are typically intel requirements. But in general, I call them intel needs. So let's say that we use nation-state threat actors as an example. If you've decided that you want to support the organization to stay on top of this threat. So once you define this intel need, and in this case, it's basically to collect and report intel related to nation-state threat actors. Let's say that is a need for your organization, and you have a stakeholder community that wants that intel. you shouldn't really stop there. You should really define, what you want to know about the nation-state threat actors. So you might want to know what the state sponsorship of this threat actor is. You might want to know the TTPs that are leveraged by the threat actor. You may want to know, are there nation-state IOCs present in your infrastructure? That could be a collection requirement or an intel need. You may want to know what the common campaign objectives that the threat actor is using. You may want to know what specific IOCs are linked to nation-state threat actors. You may want to know if that threat actor is affiliated with other nation-state groups or cyber criminal groups. You may want to know what the threat actor, the malware that the threat actor is leveraging, what CVEs does it exploit? You may want to know what impact they've had on historical, targets in the past. These are things that you may want to know about nation-state threat actors. These are all just questions or intel gaps that you need to fill to support that program. So why should you track these needs or these questions independent? So if you notice, just in this set of intel needs, some of the stakeholders that want that information may be different. The tooling that you need to collect against it may be different. So let me just run through a quick example. So let's say you need to collect intel from open source, social media, deep web, through liaison with the government, intel reporting from an intel service provider, through information sharing with an ISAC. You need to do that in order to determine the nation-state affiliation. Okay, all of these are considered collection sources. So on the other hand, you may need to compare the threat intel you received about the nation-state IOC affiliation with intel or data that you have in your SIM, your firewall, IDS, IPS, in AV, in your proxy, et cetera, to determine if the nation-state is present in your infrastructure. So these are just two intel needs, but very different collection sources. So the reason that I feel you need to track these separately is because it helps you explain why you need to purchase or why you've purchased certain intelligence tools or security investment, okay? So it'll help you justify not only your threat intelligence spend, but also your security spend. So the other reason is if you're tracking it this way, okay, when you're needing to renew a contract, let's say you're using an ISAC, or let's say you're using an intel service provider, or you're using a specific SIM. If you track these independently, you can now start to quantify, you now have quantifiable data that shows the value of your intel investment and security investment, because you can show what those vendors or what those service providers, how they're helping you solve your intel collection gaps. So, another reason why you want to track it is because the stakeholder community that will provide the valuable insight or the feedback that I talked about before, it may be different. So once you gather intel based on your needs, you really need to define who needs to receive the intel, okay, and then place them, or at least work with them on feedback. So, for example, your board or leadership team or CISO, they may be interested in knowing who is behind the IOC that may be present in the infrastructure. However, your security organization or security operations staff, they may be less interested in the nation-state affiliation because, or they're more interested in just actioning the IOCs that they can use to run a search, incorporate into a correlation rule, or set up a detection alert. They may not care what the nation state affiliation is. So that's another reason why you should kind of track these separately. It helps you make sure that you're sending intel or you're sharing intel with the right groups and you're getting the right feedback. So now that you have this set up, now you have to determine how you're going to disseminate the intel. So you have to figure out what the best vehicle is for your stakeholders to consume the intel. Okay, so it could be an automated feed. There's a lot of threat intel feeds that go directly into SIM. It could be verbal, delivered through a threat briefing. Maybe your consumer would rather consume it that way. It could be sending out an alert. It could be sharing it on SharePoint. So you have to really figure out the right way to disseminate threat intel into your stakeholder group. All right, I'm coming up a little bit on time, so I'm just going to kind of move a little bit quickly because I want to save some time for questions and answers. But so where do I start? So the bottom line is a lot of these building blocks that we took today, every organization is not going to implement all of them unless they're very mature. So you just have to recognize that if you're a small or medium-sized business or you're a large company that doesn't have a dedicated threat intel program, don't feel that after this briefing, you're going to implement every one of these, building blocks. But what you should do is champion and raise awareness in your organization that these building blocks exist and that this is what a typical threat intel program is within your organization. So you're basically raising an awareness around what threat intel is, what the building blocks are needed to implement. And then you're trying to find ways to implement some of these building blocks depending on your budget, resource, and your stakeholders' acceptance of this. So in many instances, companies, they may not have a threat intel team. They may be doing it as another duty as assigned. The most common starting point that I'm finding is to directly ingest threat intel feeds into your SIM. If you deploy most of the enterprise SIMs today, they have 10, 15, 20 or so common threat intel feeds that can go into your SIM. That's a great starting point. But I don't feel like you should stop there. But that's typically a starting point. So many companies will just stop there. They'll stop and they'll deploy a very tactical threat intel capability, and that's fine. That you're implementing it. So, but don't stop there. Okay, don't forget about the operational or strategic aspects of the program. So, and also you may not even have a SIM. I've worked with a lot of small or medium companies that don't have a SIM. So another starting point is really to inventory the teams performing threat intel functions. So, some of the building blocks that I talked about today, after the presentation today, I encourage you to download the CMU Study, look at some of the components there, and start to look inside your organization to figure out if there are other departments, other teams that are doing this, doing a threat intel function and may not be calling it that. The most common overlap is between physical security and cyber, physical threat intel and cyber threat intel. There may be tools that you can share. In every organization, I've always partnered with the physical security or physical threat intel team. In some companies, I've managed both the physical threat intel and the cyber threat intel. But in some instances, you may be able to share tools that they're using, so you don't have to make a dual investment, if you will. So those are some common starting points. Sorry, I forgot to advance the slide. I'll advance it again. So when starting out and you're raising awareness around the building blocks, you definitely need to find the bread and butter functions that are going to keep your lights on. So it's important to do a good job to manage expectations about what the threat intel program is. As I mentioned, a lot of companies will just ingest it into the SIM. They may liaison with external third parties to gather more intel. and they may publish threat intel reporting. That may be what your threat intel program is, but make sure that you define it and manage expectations of what it is. Some other bread and butter functions that are very tactical is you could send out a weekly threat landscape report that's very specific to your company or industry. So I encourage people to do that, but don't just send them threats that that may not apply to them because they're going to stop reading. So you could send that out. You can host a monthly threat landscape briefing for internal stakeholders. You can be the champion to justify why you need a SIM, or you can be the champion to making sure that threat intel is ingested into the SIM. You can establish yourself as a threat intel liaison to government, ISACs, threat intel vendors, et cetera. Make sure that you're sharing that information back in so the company is getting benefit to it. The other part is you can also define what threat intel is at your organization. If you look and there's a ton of ways to do this. If you Google it, the threat intelligence is defined, but there is a definition in the CMU report that you can use as a starting point. The bottom line is you really need to champion and raise awareness around these building blocks that you're trying to do. Okay, so I'm going to skip. I'm going to skip this slide real quick because we are running out of time. I'll talk briefly about this. So the skills that you're going to need. So in general, if you're an individual contributor, or you're doing this as another duty is assigned, if you will, and you're trying to build your program, you really need to find folks that are self-starters, are curious, they love to do research, they have good writing skills, they can translate technical subject matter into regular English, they have very good verbal skills, communication skills. These are some of the skills that you'll need if you're going to build or grow your threat intel program. I want to talk very briefly about traffic light protocol. This is a common protocol that's used. You could start here. So you can define US, this slide will show you what US CERT, how they define what traffic light protocols are. In general, you should use this or start using this within your organization. It's very simple to implement, doesn't really cost a whole lot, if not anything, but it basically starts to govern that when you're sharing information inside the organization, there's certain handling procedures that you should follow. So I encourage everyone to implement traffic light protocol. Some of the common pitfalls, so make sure that you're using reliable intel sources. Earlier I talked about threat liaison with government, ISACs, using credible threat intel vendors. You never want to provide threat intel that's not credible and it turns out to be false. So you want to make sure that you're using credible sources. You also want to make sure that even the source, the intel that you get from these sources is vetted. I always call it router. You do not want to be an intelligence router. You don't want to just get intel from an intel vendor, not evaluate it, and then send it to a stakeholder community. Your function is to make sure that the intel inside that reporting is credible. So you want to make sure you develop that sort of thing. Don't go dark. You want to keep the threat discussion going. You want to provide context around the data, and you want to standardize, the reporting function. So I know I rushed through the last few slides, but I did want to save a few minutes for questions. So I'll end there and see if there's any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, TJ. That was very interesting. So we are running a little short on time, but a couple things. So I know you were talking about the different building blocks for the threat intel program, and you started with the environmental context and the attack surface. So I know one thing we've kind of experienced here at kind of looking at an organization. We've kind of taken a look, and not every organization knows all the assets that are visible to the public. So I mean, right there, that's kind of one first element is, you have to be aware of what your adversaries can see, in order to protect them. So, that threat vulnerability. So that was just one comment I wanted to make. But it related to that. I mean, we've had to, given this current day and age, with COVID-19, back in the spring, a lot of organizations had to drastically overnight go to a large teleworking force, remote work. So how would the threat intel program be affected by a major change, a rapid change like that? Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So we definitely have a new way of working. I do feel that you can still raise awareness. Director Krebs, a few months ago, he also published, and there's some new reporting coming out now, but you have to still raise awareness around what the threat actors are going after. So, and make sure that you're not using that technology or you're patched against it. During the remote work, a lot of companies move to VPNs. They increase that visibility. Threat actors obviously are targeting VPN technology, very specific VPN technology. So you want to make sure that if you are deploying things like that, you want to raise awareness around what threat actors are targeting that those technologies. In terms of data loss, data prevention, you really want to make sure that when folks are moving to personal devices, you want to make sure that their data is protected, because once the endpoint is disconnected from the VPN, that asset is vulnerable. So if it's connected to the internet, you want to make sure that you have, host-based controls on that endpoint to further protect the data. And then once that data is lost or stolen, you also want to look into technologies that will help you track, monitor, and report back where that data is once it goes outside of your infrastructure. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not.
Oh, no, that was great. And in fact, I was just on a teleconference the other day, and it seems since the remote work happened, it seems like there's been an increase in the ransomware attack. So there's been an explosion of that. You've taken folks out of the kind of the core center, and dispersed them. And like I said, it seems based on the recent info I was seeing, where the ransomware have just taken off dramatically.
Yeah. So what's even scarier about ransomware these days is, before it was, the ransomware operators would basically, target you, lock your data, and tell you, give me money or I'm not giving you the decryption keys. That was scary enough. But now what they're doing is they're exfiltrating that data, and then they're going to, they'll either, try to publicly shame you, or what we've seen in some instances is they'll exfiltrate your data, and then they'll go to your customers to try and extort them, further, impacting your brand. So ransomware operators have definitely got a little bit more sophisticated. They certainly are taking advantage of the remote work situation, but now they're really exfiltrating data. So that you have to, be cautious of that. So.
Yeah, and in fact, that's exactly what was discussed during the conference I was in. And the term extortion was, specifically used. And like you said before, they were looking for the cash, but now, they, like you said, they are publicly publishing this information. So they've kind of ratcheted it up and taken it to a new level. So
yeah.
So I guess the other thing I was kind of curious, you kind of talked about the protecting data, and I know you worked in national, for National Grid. So kind of like in that environment with industrial control systems, is it, protecting the data in that environment, is that an issue, or it seems there that there's more where they could affect system operations. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So in that environment, insider threat obviously is a big issue or a big threat category for that. The other part of it is, so a lot of energy companies will deploy, they're like looking at IDS, inside an ICS environment to help detect certain things. But in general, it still goes around patching. A lot of the technology in a grid operation, sometimes when you buy a piece of equipment, it's expected to be used for 20 years. So when the operating system that you buy that equipment on, is 20 years old. So there's still this, patch management, vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management part of the ICS environment that's still pretty popular. So in general, yeah, that's typically what the threats are, the approaches that they're using. And then it really goes down to when you have an operator that's coming in to service the equipment. That, again, that's part of the insider threat perspective. It's really around controlling that endpoint that's going to connect in and push a firmware update. So there's some security that needs to go around that. But in general, that's kind of like the common secure defense in depth, if you will, for those sort of operations.
Okay, thank you. And I guess the last thing I'll ask right now, and we'll wrap up after this, but you talked about the self-protecting data. And so I'm just curious, is there, in that process, is there a lot of extra overhead added to, this self-protecting data you're talking about? Is there additional costs or trade-offs there?
Yeah. So the technology, there is an additional cost for that. But in general, the overhead is very minimal. So you don't have to install a endpoint agent. I know a lot of organizations are, let's not put another endpoint control on our endpoint because it's already stuffed with a bunch. So it's not an endpoint product, if you will. It's basically a wrapper technology. So even the size of the process is not significant, if you will. But it's, there are additional costs to it. It does provide a lot of new threat intel that you could use to take control of your data. So if your data is lost and you want to know, where is it? Is it in the US or is it in China or Russia or any other part of the world? If you want to know what device it is it authorized to be on that device? Yes or no? If you want to know if it's being accessed during the right time frame, all self-protecting data can do all that now and report that back in near real time. So that's the exciting part of that, is that I really feel that it's filling a threat intel gap that a lot of programs are missing, to be able to know where your data is at all times, even when it travels outside of your organization.
Okay, great. Thanks for answering that. So once again, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your experience with us. I thought it was very interesting.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Sure. And so I know, we ran a little late today, but if folks have questions, you can send them to info@csiac.org, or if you go check out the briefing, we'll be posting the slides and the recording of the webinar. If you go to that site on our website, You can also post questions there, and I'm sure if you have questions, we can get back to TJ and have him answer the questions for you. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and have a great day, and we'll see you at our next presentation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Yeah. All right, bye now.